Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Oligarchy in America, Power, Justice, and the Rule of the Few by Luke Winslow, narrated by Tom Parks. Preface. On an episode of the TV series Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, Jerry Seinfeld admitted he had no idea what oligarchy meant. To me, it sounds like a butter, he said. Imitating the formal voice of a TV pitchman, he suggested, "Try oligarchy on your toast. It has less saturated fat." Seinfeld is not alone. Oligarchy is one of the most widely used, yet least well-understood concepts in American public argument. Our discursive deficiencies were amplified in February 2022, when Vladimir Putin and the Russian military invaded Ukraine. According to Google Trends, online searches for the term exploded. Russian oligarchs emerged as a handy shortcut for explaining a perplexing geopolitical event. In that context, oligarch referred to a group of men leveraging their status as Kremlin insiders and party apparatchiks for economic gain. Ultra-rich Russians came to be called oligarchs as they enjoined the Russian government in defending and enhancing their wealth. Oligarchy was applied smoothly to Roman Abramovich, Boris Berezovsky, and Alexander Smolensky, but less so to Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Charles Koch. Donald Trump and Fred Smith were billionaires. Victor Vekselberg was an oligarch. But what's the difference? And why does it seem like oligarchy is unique to Eastern Europe and foreign to the United States? This book argues that oligarchy is a defining but understudied feature of American democracy. As a discrete governing logic, I introduced the term democratic oligarchy to describe the marriage of economic wealth with political power through the symbolic acquisition of democratic consent. In what follows, I seek to locate this definition in the distinguishing boundaries and features of American democracy, examine the rhetoricity of those features in public discourse and affective circularities, and then link those features to systematic and generalizable principles informing the rhetorical dimensions of our lives. American democracy seems to be at an inflection point. Public conversations are filled with lamentations and eulogies as American democracy hangs in the balance. One goal of this book is to redirect those lamentations by suggesting that democratic oligarchy says less about the survival of democracy writ large than it does about our capacity to communicate productively about the discursive core of American democracy, including Enlightenment understandings of self-rule and open debate, shared prosperity prompted by market economies, and the ability of strong civic and economic institutions to lubricate a market economy as a generator of wealth and security. Jeremy Engels proposed a familiar way to begin such an inquiry by recommending that if we want to get our minds right, a good place to start is by getting our language right. Thinking at one higher level of abstraction, if we want to improve our society, we will have to change our language, our rhetoric, our ways of relating to ourselves and our fellow citizens through discourse. Such is the purpose of this book. Introduction. During the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign, Donald Trump promised middle-class tax relief by passing legislation lowering the business tax from 35% to 15%. But after Trump won, and with Republican majorities in Congress, his promises went unfulfilled during his first year in office, until Fred Smith got involved. A graduate of Yale, the founder and CEO of FedEx, and an ex-Marine, Fred Smith also wanted Trump to cut taxes. But Smith did more than complain when Trump did not. Smith actually wrote his own tax plan, cutting the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20% and allowing businesses to write off new investments. Smith's tax plan promised to spark a resurgence of business investment in America. Increased investment would then benefit both the CEOs and the American public, because businesses would innovate, expand, and hire. The fundamental problem with the U.S. tax code is that it punishes investment, Smith said. And at the end of the day, investment is what produces high-paying jobs. If you make the United States a better place to invest, there is no question in my mind that we would see a renaissance of capital investment, a growth in GDP, and an increase in income for our blue-collar workforce in the United States. Smith framed his tax plan as an altruistic mechanism benefiting ordinary Americans. Investment is the only way to make blue-collar workers, people that don't have college degrees, more productive and have more income, he said. When taxes are cut, corporations like FedEx start investing more in America. The economy grows, and everyone is better off. Smith employed a sports metaphor aligned with Trump's America First message. It's just like us playing basketball. And on our end of the court, we're playing with a 12-foot basket, and everybody else that we compete with around the world is shooting on a 10-foot basket. Smith's basketball metaphor highlighted fears of a rigged global competition, limiting American innovation and supremacy. He affirmed the link among tax cuts, corporate investment, and increased wages for the blue-collar workforce, and he explained away the self-serving impact of his tax plan by tying together economic justice and the belief that, in America, everyone has the chance to be a FedEx shareholder. By 2017, Fred Smith's tax plan had become law, and he reaped the rewards. Before the new tax cuts, FedEx paid an effective tax rate of 34%, or $1.5 billion in taxes. After the tax cuts, instead of owing the federal government $1.5 billion in taxes, FedEx had a negative tax rate, and the federal government ended up owing FedEx money. But FedEx did not use the savings to spark investment, as Fred Smith promised. Investment declined after the tax cuts passed. Instead, FedEx increased its dividends and stock buybacks to push up its stock price. We have no shortage of provocative and colorful names to describe an economic and political system serving the interests of billionaires like Fred Smith. The purpose of Oligarchy in America is to highlight the limitations of our extant conceptual tools, and then redress this gap by defining oligarchy, locating its distinctive features in public argument, and tracing the development of its emergence as a distinctive governing logic. My methodological goal is to light up a synthetic pathway forward, allowing for an ontological critique of the American political economy, transcending instrumentalist naivete and ideological futility, and illuminating the genealogical level of power relations by discursively tracking affective modalities through symbolic and discursive appeals. More simply, understanding oligarchy in America requires focused attention on both the thought leaders articulating oligarchic arguments and the discursive source of slow, subtle, and hard-to-pin-down public arguments generated by the think tanks, foundations, and educational systems. Going forward, I assume that the rhetorical potency of a discrete oligarchic class cannot come from persuading the public to accept their unpopular policies. The discipline of rhetoric is not well equipped to make those causal connections anyway. The arising oligarchy requires understanding the rhetoricity preceding and operating independently of symbolic intervention. Defining democratic oligarchy. The etymology of oligarchy comes from the Greek, meaning rule of the few. But left unexplained in that etymology is how oligarchy differs from other political systems also concentrating the rule of the few, including plutocracy, autocracy, monarchy, and fascism. Also left unexplained by rule of the few is how oligarchy compares to more common terms, such as conservative, liberal, or libertarian. Recall Fred Smith. His alliance with a Republican president makes sense. Fred Smith is no liberal progressive. Beyond higher tax rates and more regulation, liberal economic policy is premised on the public's willingness to let Smith make a lot of money, as long as the benefits are shared. But if rising tides do not lift all our boats, Smith is exposed to the masses' capricious whims. His FedEx drivers and their allies can retaliate at the ballot box and redistribute his wealth. Classical liberalism does not maximize his profitability either. Because Smith cannot enjoin the government on his behalf, a lucrative source of wealth is left untapped. But the conservative and libertarian economic systems associated with the political right are also not ideal for Smith. Conservative nostalgia is as impractical as it is unprofitable, and the focus on social issues distracts from making money. Libertarianism's minimal taxes and regulations may attract Smith's attention, and without the social baggage, but when put into practice, libertarianism's anarchist leanings would leave FedEx without publicly educated supply chain managers and publicly maintained roads. Further, Smith is worth more than $4 billion, not because he outperformed his competition in a free market. He is well aware that a free market allows for new competitors, shifting consumer preferences, and market fluctuations. A lucrative market needs robust monitoring and protection. There is no better entity than the state, with its immense symbolic, legal, and coercive resources to do just that. In her book Plutocrats, Chrystia Freeland details the overlap and divergence between oligarchy and plutocracy by showing how the emergence of a class of the global super-rich is aided as their economic might grows in relation to their political muscle. Freeland details how massive wealth can grow almost inevitably from the rent-seeking efforts of the ultra-rich when they control political machinations. In his book, The 9.9%, Matthew Stewart describes a rigged economic game, in large part, because a new aristocratic class is enjoining the state to protect and enhance their wealth. In each case, plutocracy and aristocracy describe an outcome in which wealth and power are concentrated into the hands of a select few. To supplement those terms, democratic oligarchy explains less the end result and more the process by which economic and political power are married. More than a governing logic or a set of wealth-concentrating policies, democratic oligarchy describes how American oligarchs acquire the consent of the American people to support a political economy oriented toward the interests of the wealthy. Unlike plutocracy or aristocracy, democratic oligarchy is not a fixed endpoint or a coherent governing logic reducible to rent-seeking actions or regressive tax policies. Democracies can be oligarchic or anti-oligarchic, just as democracies can be liberal or illiberal. Accordingly, it is not conceptually useful to try to draw a line between Fred Smith, who is an oligarch, and his FedEx truck drivers, who are not. Instead, democratic oligarchy is theorized as an inventional resource, a culture of political organization, explaining power concentration in complementary and incommensurate ways, while also highlighting the under-theorized interventions of the state in American democracy. As a resource of rhetorical invention, democratic oligarchy is defined by an institutional arrangement in which the ultra-rich create a discrete class consciousness based on leveraging the state to accumulate wealth. The constitutive features of an oligarchic class consciousness are marked by the assumption that the primary purpose of the state is to protect and maximize the economic interests of a discrete capitalist ruling class. Clyde Barrow finds evidence of ruling class domination in the degree to which the affluent exercise decisive influence over state policy, and to which a capitalist class shapes the state apparatus through interlocking positions of governmental, coercive, and administrative authority. The result is an observable, differentiated, and incommensurate class of affluent individuals united by the defense of a political order affording class privileges through the ownership and control of economic life, based on an advantageous relationship with the state. But the coherence of an oligarchic class is not limited to economic constitutive parameters. A set of discrete cultural values, even non-economic linkages, cultural affiliations, lifestyles, common experiences, and social interactions form a discursive substructure of class cohesion. To note the presence of a discrete class consciousness among the ultra-rich in America can sound tone-deaf, cynical, and even unpatriotic. In contrast, references to the middle class or the working class are common in public conversations, along with the specific social formation and observable characteristics marking a middle class or working class identity. Plus, capitalist market rivalries are supposed to limit the solidarity, cohesion, and consciousness of a discrete ruling class. But despite the potential for rivalries among the ultra-rich, there is what Barrow calls a clear pattern of coordination between elites based on the perception of a range of common interests, distinct from the rest of society. In the end, the rich are especially class-conscious, even if they are subtle about it, because the rich need class consciousness to defend a social order affording them wealth and power. By braiding together disparate systems of power, an oligarchic class consciousness highlights the difference between democratic oligarchs and those who are just really rich by drawing a conceptual distinction between wealth and income. Income explains the ability to purchase day-to-day necessities, like the cost of jet fuel or crown molding in a London apartment. By contrast, wealth is more readily deployed for political influence. Not all high-income individuals are oligarchs. An almost certainly apocryphal story has it that when F. Scott Fitzgerald tried to explain to Ernest Hemingway that the rich are different than you and me, Hemingway cut him off by saying, "Yes, they have more money." Advancing that conversation, oligarchs are different than you and me, but not just because they have more money. Oligarchs are different because they use that money to bridge the economic-political chasm in a way the rest of us cannot. Plus, not all oligarchs are high income. Amazon paid Jeff Bezos a base salary of $81,840 in 2019 and 2020. But that income does not account for his political influence. A second way democratic oligarchy affirms and extends our extant vocabulary is by highlighting the institutional setup where the ultra-rich can leverage the state's unique infrastructure, educational, and political resources to accumulate wealth. With profit maximization as the telos, the oligarchic-oriented enlist the state to maximize profit, rather than eschew its capacities for the ideological purity demanded by membership in the political right. Instead of seeking to drown the government in the bathtub, oligarchs use the state to defend and enhance their wealth and power. Democratic oligarchy is distinguished by a marked ambivalence toward majoritarian democracy, free market capitalism, and the size and scope of federal and state governmental institutions. Like Fred Smith, the oligarchs examined here did not become rich by competing on a level playing field. And they did not reorient the American political landscape by passively accepting the capriciousness of majoritarian democracy. Oligarchy is not reliant on the market or the masses. Oligarchs understand, as much as any liberal progressive, the state's importance. The state and the market are inextricably bound. In fact, there is no right/left ideological seesaw. Instead, there is a tangled web of political economy marked by a complex confluence of state policy and corporate machinations. Democratic oligarchy is not limited to military and police actions, lawmakers, political parties, or electoral politics, and thus military and the police, lawmakers, political parties, or electoral politics will not be my primary focus. Instead, democratic oligarchy maintains a nominal absence from political authority, an absence highlighting democratic oligarchy's rhetorical distinctiveness. In the United States, oligarchs use what looks like the absence of authority to cover indirect political actions. Oligarchs cannot be voted out of office. Oligarchs do not need their own standing armies, and oligarchs do not need to rely on crime syndicates. Oligarchs do not need to bribe judges, because they are already legally protected. There are exceptions. Vladimir Putin has crossed the chasm between economic and political power. The U.S. Congress is the wealthiest in human history, and ultra-rich Americans like Pete DuPont, Nelson Rockefeller, David Koch, Michael Bloomberg, and Donald Trump have used their wealth to run for political office. But the rationale for their formal position of power only illustrates the indirect exercise of oligarchy. Putin and Trump may be very rich, but they do not justify their nominal positions of power based on their own self-interest. They lead as an act of public service. Democratic oligarchy influences American democracy without direct control of the state apparatus. Unlike an English monarchy or African kleptocracy, democratic oligarchy's ability to shape public policy is dependent on its ability to organize class interests within the political system and deploy resources toward influencing the representative systems, institutions, and individuals who do shape policy. Consider the difference between oligarchy and an autocratic dictatorship. American liberal democracy is not marked by an oligarchic class directly making money from government-owned or government-regulated companies like in Russia, because in the United States, oligarchy is subtly embedded in the political system. But before democratic oligarchy focuses on downstream legislative policies, it intervenes upstream into the machinations of power concentration. This distinction draws from Aristotle, whose conceptualization of oligarchy focuses more on how rulers are selected and less on what rulers do once in office. The upstream inventions are important to consider at the outset because democratic oligarchy will often appear to be a contradictory political philosophy and an incoherent governing logic. Democratic oligarchy will seem to be selectively, sporadically, and inconsistently applied, in large part because oligarchy is more focused on maximizing the strategic flexibility of the few who should rule and less focused on how they should rule. For this reason, I avoid conceptualizing democracy and oligarchy as separate spheres. I am also careful about drawing rigid distinctions between democratic oligarchy and conservatism. Although public conversations often unite the ultra-rich like Fred Smith and the political right, those conversations assume a fictive political ideological axis. I concede useful points of conceptual entailment across democratic oligarchy and the right. George Will, in his 2018 book The Conservative Sensibility, defines the term conservative by asking what conservatives seek to conserve. He concisely answers his own question. Conservatives seek to conserve the American founding. Will goes on to describe the clear mission of American conservatism as articulating and demonstrating the continuing pertinence of the founders' thinking. In turn, conservatives seek to prune the functions of the state, reducing regulation, lowering taxes, localizing control, and prioritizing fiscal discipline. George Will writes, "The law's primary purposes are to keep the peace and facilitate quotidian transactions, to resolve disputes and regularize behaviors and expectations. The law is not supposed to be salvific. It is not written to perfect either the individual or the community. In action, the political impact of conservatism is a pruned state marked by limited government, designed to reorient the state toward an earlier historical moment when the strong and free competed without the interference of a meddling government bureaucracy. Likewise, democratic oligarchy affirms the strict hierarchies at the foundation of these accounts. Overlapping assumptions include belief in a natural human hierarchy and that hell is the result of trying to be wiser than the divine. The capacity to generate capital raises one's status on the power hierarchy, as those who can generate the most capital are considered the most human. As Foley writes, each citizen is an oikonomon, a self-sufficient economic agent with the duty to take care of themselves. To the victor go the spoils, and so increased risk signifies increased opportunity and increased humanity, and the market reflects the final score. Because capital generation correlates to one's humanity, persistent inequalities are encouraged. The right's aversion to equality and egalitarianism resonates with democratic oligarchies' preferred power hierarchies. But with these overlaps noted, I want to suggest that democratic oligarchy offers a conceptually, theoretically, and politically distinct perspective on the American political economy. Democratic oligarchy rejects the individualistic metaphysics assigned to the political right in exchange for a discrete class consciousness of the ultra-rich seeking to enlist the state to maximize profits. Democratic oligarchy maintains limited loyalty to laissez-faire economics and free market capitalism. Unlike Edmund Burke's conservatism, democratic oligarchy reflects selective allegiance to a free market's ability to reward the winners and punish the losers. And unlike Russell Kirk and George Will, democratic oligarchy maintains limited loyalty to the country's framers and to the social and cultural traditionalism of the family, community, or church. Conservative populism thinks institutions suppress the people, and thus positions its outlook in an antagonistic relationship with the federal government. Conservative populism thinks the political establishment's discrimination and suppression of the people is unjust. In contrast, democratic oligarchy enlists institutions for the precise purpose of discriminating against the people. For example, William F. Buckley famously urged the nascent conservative movement to stand athwart history and yell "Stop!" Democratic oligarchy assumes if you are forced to stand athwart and yell at the forward march of history, then something must be wrong with you. Paul Johnson also marries conservative and neoliberal critiques of central planning to differentiate those systems from the left. Osnos includes a movement to delegitimate federal power as part of the libertarian fringe. In contrast, democratic oligarchy seeks to control central planning and legitimate the federal power of the state to ensure just power hierarchies. Finally, consider the diverging political subjectivities produced by democratic oligarchy and the familiar concepts on the political right. Engels argues the neoliberal art of government produces political acquiescence, and Johnson suggests conservative populism drains the polity of democratic potential. To be sure, democratic oligarchy at times affirms political apathy, but as I will show in the case study chapters, democratic oligarchy also inspires an active political subjectivity, based not on individual material self-interest, but on ensuring just power hierarchies. As I will argue, oligarchy is willing to use history as a source of rhetorical invention, but never feels bound to maintain ideological purity when profit maximization demands purity be compromised. Oligarchy, democracy, and symbolic consent. Most fascist dictatorships and plutocratic autocracies are propped up by a monopoly on resources, especially the capacity to commit violence. Democratic oligarchy is understated in comparison, serving a biopolitical function by enticing a particular subjectivity that is free to choose another political economic system. Ordinary Americans who are not ultra-rich are induced and invited, but not coerced, to accept the natural subordination of a social order and political system that is not in their interests. This ideological effort involves the aggregation of perceived interests across class lines to be sure, but also the congealing of political formations across economic blocs and the coordination and fusing of cultural interests and values. Never limited to public policy, ideological influence and normative loyalty is secured through political myths, national symbols, and rituals of participation, far beyond fiscal or legal considerations. Recall that Fred Smith's self-serving political maneuvering was not illegal. Likewise, there is also nothing illegal about Apple setting up corporate fronts in Nevada to avoid paying taxes in California. In 2018, Facebook made $15 billion in legal profit in Ireland, or roughly $10 million for every Facebook employee based in Ireland. Although headquartered in New York City, Bristol Myers Squibb made nearly $5 billion of profit in Ireland, or about $7.5 million for each employee. And GE is well within their legal rights to eliminate 1/5 of its workforce in the United States while accumulating $92 billion in offshore profit. When the public...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?